Was that was the emergency? Hi.
Jack Sullivan Children Case. A Mother's Silence. The morning that changed everything. Imagine waking up to absolute silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping house, but the kind of silence that makes your heart stop. The kind that tells you something is terribly, irreversibly wrong. This is the story of that silence and the two innocent children who vanished into it forever. On May 2nd, in the remote wilderness of Nova Scotia, 6-year-old Lilly Sullivan and her 4-year-old brother Jack disappeared without a trace. But this isn't just another missing children case. This is the story of red flags ignored, warning signs dismissed, and most disturbing of all, a mother who walked away from the search for her own children and never looked back. Before we dive into this haunting case, if stories like this move you to seek justice and truth, please subscribe to our channel. These children deserve to have their story heard, and your support helps us bring light to cases that might otherwise fade into darkness. The morning began like any other in the isolated trailer where the Sullivan children lived with their mother, Maleah Brooks Murray, and stepfather Daniel Martel. Tucked deep in the Nova Scotia backwoods, the home sat surrounded by dense forest, miles from the nearest neighbor. It was the kind of place where screams would echo unheard, where days could pass without a single soul knowing what happened behind closed doors. According to Maleah, she was drifting in and out of sleep that morning, listening to the children playing in the next room. Lilly was homesick from school, too unwell to attend, possibly feverish and coughing. Jack, her devoted little brother, stayed by her side as always. They were inseparable, those two. Best friends who did everything together. But here's where the first red flag appears. Maleah claims she continued dozing until nearly 10 a.m., despite having a sick child in her care. No temperature checks, no medicine, no breakfast prepared, just sleep, while two vulnerable children were left unsupervised in one of the most remote locations imaginable. When she finally woke to silence, panic should have set in immediately. The kind of primal fear that sends a parent running, screaming their children's names. Instead, Maleah's response was measured, almost clinical. She walked through the house, looked outside, and made the 911 call that would change everything. But investigators began to suspect that everything had already changed days earlier. The last confirmed sighting of Lilly and Jack wasn't on May 2nd. It was April 29th. 3 full days before anyone reported them missing. 3 days of silence that no one questioned, no one investigated, no one seemed to notice. In a case where every second matters, those 72 hours represent something far more sinister than a simple timeline error. When the RCMP arrived at the scene, they didn't just pull surveillance footage from May 2nd. They went back to April 27th. Think about that decision. Experienced investigators, looking at this case, felt compelled to examine 5 full days of evidence. What did they see that made them question when these children really disappeared? The implications are chilling. If Lilly and Jack vanished on April 29th, then someone had 3 days to prepare. 3 days to craft a story. 3 days to decide how to handle the inevitable questions. And when those questions finally came, the answers would reveal a pattern of behavior so disturbing that it haunts everyone who encounters this case. Shadows in the timeline. The devil, they say, is in the details. And in the disappearance of Lilly and Jack Sullivan, those details paint a picture that becomes more disturbing with each revelation. What initially appeared to be a tragic case of children wandering into dangerous wilderness began to look like something far more calculated, far more sinister. The timeline is the key to understanding this case, and it's the timeline that first raised red flags for investigators. Picture this. 2 young children, living in complete isolation, haven't been seen by anyone outside their household since April 29th. No school attendance. No interactions with neighbors, because there were no neighbors close enough to interact with. No visual confirmation from a single person beyond the walls of that remote trailer. For 3 entire days, Lilly and Jack Sullivan existed in a void of accountability. No teachers asked where they were. No friends knocked on the door. No community members saw them playing outside. In most places, when children disappear from normal routines, someone notices. But Maleah had chosen to live in the one place where notice was impossible. The isolation wasn't accidental. This wasn't a family that happened to end up in the backwoods of Nova Scotia. This was a deliberate choice to live as far from oversight, from community, from help as possible. Maleah was the only Indigenous resident in the area, completely cut off from her McMahon roots and support systems. She had chosen invisibility. And invisibility, investigators would learn, can be the perfect accomplice to tragedy. When the RCMP pulled surveillance footage from April 27th onward, they were looking for evidence of when the children were last verifiably alive and accounted for. Standard protocol in missing children cases typically focuses on the last 24 to 48 hours. But going back 5 days? That suggests investigators suspected the official timeline was a lie from the very beginning. The geographical setup was almost too perfect for concealment. No ring cameras on neighboring houses because there were no neighboring houses. No passing cars with dash cams because the roads were empty gravel paths. No store footage of the children buying candy or playing in a parking lot because the nearest store was miles away. Just endless forest, perfect silence, and a window of time where anything could have happened without a single witness. In that isolation, 3 days is an eternity. It's enough time to clean a scene. Enough time to dispose of evidence. Enough time to rehearse a story until it sounds believable. And most importantly, it's enough time for a guilty person to decide how to handle the inevitable investigation. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this timeline isn't what happened during those missing days. It's how calmly someone waited for the right moment to report the children gone. If they truly disappeared on May 2nd, the panic should have been immediate and raw. If they'd been missing since April 29th, why wait? Why allow precious hours to tick by when every moment could mean the difference between life and death? The answer might be that someone already knew those moments wouldn't make a difference. Someone knew that no amount of searching would bring Lilly and Jack home, because someone knew exactly where they were. If you're following this case closely and want to see justice for these children, subscribing to our content helps us continue investigating stories like this. The truth matters, and sometimes it takes all of us speaking up to ensure it comes to light. The person who should have been screaming loudest for answers chose instead to disappear into her own silence. The mother who disappeared. In every missing child case, there's a moment when the parent's desperation reaches a breaking point. When the carefully constructed composure cracks and raw, primal fear takes over. It's the moment they grab investigators by the shoulders, begging for answers. The moment they break down on live television, pleading with whoever took their baby to bring them home. The moment they refuse to sleep, refuse to eat, refuse to rest until their child is back in their arms. Maleah Brooks Murray never had that moment. Instead, she did something that still leaves investigators and behavioral experts stunned. On May 3rd, just one day after reporting her children missing, she walked into a tactical operations center where key decisions about the search were being made. This wasn't a press event. It was a working session where families typically cling to every word, desperate for hope, hanging on every strategy that might bring their children home. Halfway through the briefing, Maleah stood up. She said she needed medical attention. She walked to the back of an ambulance. And then, without explanation, without goodbye, without looking back, she left with her mother and her youngest child. She walked out on the people trying to save Lilly and Jack, and she never came back. Let that sink in. A mother walked away from the search for her own children and never returned. Not once. Not even when new leads emerged. Not even when fresh searches were launched. Not even when the entire community rallied to find her babies. But her exit from the search was just the beginning. What followed was a pattern of behavior so cold, so detached, that it defied every instinct we expect from a grieving parent. She cut off all communication with Daniel Martel, the stepfather who continued to cooperate with police, who continued to show up, who continued to beg for public help. She blocked him on social media, erasing him from her digital world as if he'd never existed. This was the same man who had shared a home with her children, who had witnessed their last known moments alive. If she truly believed he was innocent, why the sudden severance? If she suspected him of involvement, Why hadn't she voiced those suspicions to investigators? The radio silence suggested something else entirely: damage control. While Daniel underwent polygraph tests, handed over electronics, and appeared at every press conference begging for information, Maleah had physically removed herself from Pictou County entirely. She'd gone to stay with family in Colchester, distancing herself from the epicenter of the investigation just when her presence was most crucial. But perhaps the most telling aspect of her behavior was what she didn't do. No social media posts asking for help finding her children. No press conferences with tearful pleas. No interviews where she described what Lilly and Jack meant to her, how much she missed them, how desperate she was to hold them again. The silence wasn't just notable, it was deafening. Even more disturbing was the language she used in her limited statements. Within 24 hours of the disappearance, she was using words like grief, pain, and mourning. These are emotions reserved for confirmed death, not active searches. Nowhere in her comments were the urgent cries of hope that characterized genuine missing child cases. No, bring them home. No, please help us. No, we won't stop looking. Instead, her tone read like a eulogy delivered before the funeral. Psychologists know that premature grief language can be a red flag. It often indicates foreknowledge, a mind that has already processed an outcome that shouldn't yet be known. When the RCMP launched a renewed large-scale search on May 17th and 18th, involving tactical teams, drones, and K-9 units, Daniel Martel was there. He answered questions, urged the public to keep looking, spoke lovingly about the children's personalities and interests. Maleah was nowhere to be seen. No public record, no footage, no statement. Not even a passing mention of her presence during what would be the final intensive search effort. The pattern was clear. While the stepfather remained visibly involved, desperately seeking answers, the biological mother had retreated completely. It no longer looked like grief, it looked like avoidance. And as more details emerged about drug paraphernalia allegedly found in the home and vehicle and Child Protective Services involvement, the retreat began to look less like trauma and more like strategy. By the time the search efforts were suspended, one truth had become undeniable. The person who should have been fighting hardest for Lilly and Jack had stopped fighting entirely. She hadn't just lost her children, she had abandoned the search for them. Now, let us examine how the words she chose and the way she spoke about that terrible morning reveal patterns that behavioral experts find deeply troubling. Because sometimes, what someone doesn't say speaks louder than what they do. Lies, language, and red flags. The human mind reveals itself through language, especially under stress. When we're telling the truth about traumatic events, our words are messy, emotional, and deeply personal. We stumble over details, contradict ourselves in minor ways, and speak from the heart rather than the head. But when we're crafting a narrative, when we're trying to control what people think happened, our language becomes something else entirely. Maleah Brooks Murray's words about the morning her children disappeared weren't the desperate cries of a mother in shock. They were the carefully chosen phrases of someone trying to tell a very specific story. "What happened was we woke up," she began. Not "I woke up, we woke up." This linguistic choice is significant because it immediately distributes responsibility. In moments of genuine crisis, parents speak in first person. "I couldn't find my baby. I called for help. I ran through the house screaming their names." But Maleah consistently used collective language, subconsciously distancing herself from individual accountability. Even more revealing was how she described the children's behavior and the house itself. Both she and Daniel used identical language about the sliding door. "We can't hear it when it opens." In separate interviews, they repeated this phrase almost word for word. For grieving parents experiencing genuine trauma, spontaneous speech rarely matches so precisely. When multiple witnesses repeat identical wording, it often suggests rehearsal rather than recollection, a story practiced behind closed doors. Then came the pink blanket, a piece of evidence that should have been straightforward but instead revealed another layer of deception. Daniel told authorities and media that he found the blanket himself, just outside the home. But buried in police audio logs was a different truth. Maleah had originally mentioned finding it. This contradiction, subtle yet undeniable, raised the question of who really discovered this crucial piece of evidence, and more importantly, why their stories didn't align. Was the blanket meant to anchor the timeline, to suggest the children had only recently vanished? Was it planted to support the narrative of a sudden disappearance rather than something more calculated? In a case already plagued by missing timelines and vague witness accounts, the pink blanket became another fracture in a story crumbling under scrutiny. But perhaps most disturbing was how Maleah described her children's personalities when asked about potential abduction scenarios. She didn't portray them as kids who would hide in fear or cling to each other if lost in the woods. Instead, she emphasized how trusting they were, how they would talk to anyone, how they didn't understand stranger danger. On the surface, this might seem like honest parenting, acknowledging her children's innocent nature. But to forensic psychologists, it raised red flags. This language preemptively supported the idea that the children must have been taken by someone. It prepared listeners to believe in a specific scenario while redirecting suspicion away from the home and toward a faceless, nameless threat. Why emphasize how easily lured the children were? Why plant that image unless you wanted people to stop looking closer to home? Equally telling was what Maleah never said. Throughout all her limited statements, she never expressed the primal fears any parent would have. No mention of hunger, no fear about the cold, no wondering whether Lilly had her asthma puffer or if Jack had a blanket. No tears about their terror, no anguish about their pain. It was never, "Are they safe?" It was always, "They're gone." This absence of basic empathy, of instinctual parental panic, tells its own story. In nearly every legitimate case of missing children, the first things parents scream about are basic needs. They're hungry. They're scared. Please find them before nightfall. But Maleah's statements lacked that urgency, that emotional realism, that raw humanity. The pattern extended beyond just her words to her actions in the days following the disappearance. While Daniel continued to cooperate with authorities, undergoing polygraph tests, handing over electronic devices, appearing at press conferences, Maleah had severed all connection to the investigation. The contrast was stark, one adult desperately seeking answers, the other retreating into silence. Then came the most damaging revelation of all. According to multiple sources, Child Protective Services had advised Maleah to leave the home she shared with Daniel. The reason wasn't just emotional trauma, it was allegations of drug paraphernalia found both inside the home and in her vehicle. If true, this cast a chilling new light on the environment where Lilly and Jack had been living and raised questions about what might have been happening behind closed doors long before they vanished. An unsafe environment. A possible CPS intervention. A mother told to leave. And she did, completely, permanently, without looking back. Now we'll discover when all these red flags are viewed together, they form a pattern that's impossible to ignore. If you're invested in seeing justice for Lilly and Jack, please subscribe and share the story. Sometimes it takes an entire community speaking up to ensure the truth comes to light. The silence that speaks volumes. In the world of missing children cases, there are patterns that investigators recognize immediately. The frantic parent who can't stop talking, begging for help, sharing every detail that might bring their child home. The parent who speaks in present tense because they can't accept their child might be gone. The parent who becomes the loudest advocate on the planet because silence feels like betrayal. Maleah Brooks Murray fit none of these patterns. Instead, she created a new one. A pattern so disturbing that it haunts everyone who encounters this case. Let's consider what we know. 2 children disappeared from one of the most isolated locations in Nova Scotia. Their mother, who should have been their greatest advocate, walked away from the search effort after just one day and never returned. She cut all communication with the stepfather, who continued desperately seeking answers. She moved away from the area entirely, distancing herself from the investigation when proximity should have been everything. She spoke about her missing children in past tense within hours of their disappearance. She used language that suggested grief over active hope. She emphasized how easily the children could be lured by strangers, preemptively directing suspicion away from the home. And throughout it all, She maintained a detachment that defied every instinct we expect from a loving parent. But perhaps most damning of all is the timeline. The last confirmed sighting of Lilly and Jack was April 29th, yet no one reported them missing until May 2nd. 3 full days where these children existed in a void of accountability, where anything could have happened without a single witness. 3 days that investigators found suspicious enough to pull surveillance footage going back to April 27th. The geographical isolation that Maleah chose for her family wasn't just about privacy, it was about invisibility. In that remote trailer, surrounded by dense forest, with no neighbors close enough to hear or see, someone could make 2 children disappear without anyone knowing for days. The perfect setting for concealment. When you combine the suspicious timeline with Maleah's immediate emotional detachment, her flight from the search efforts, and the allegations of drug paraphernalia that led Child Protective Services to advise her removal from the home, a picture emerges that investigators can't ignore. Not one of these factors alone proves guilt, but together they form a pattern of behavior that challenges every assumption about how an innocent parent should respond to their children's disappearance. Daniel Martel, despite not being the biological parent, remained visible throughout the investigation. He handed over devices, took polygraph tests, appeared at press conferences, and begged the public for help. His cooperation was complete and ongoing. Meanwhile, Maleah disappeared from the story as thoroughly as her children had disappeared from that trailer. The silence that surrounds this case isn't just about missing answers, it's about missing advocacy. Someone should be fighting for Lilly and Jack Sullivan. Someone should be demanding investigations, pushing for searches, keeping their names in the public eye. But the person most responsible for that fight walked away on day 1 and never came back. Today, the case remains open but effectively stalled. No arrests have been made. No charges have been filed. But the questions linger like shadows in those Nova Scotia woods. Where are Lilly and Jack Sullivan? What happened during those missing days in late April and early May? And why did their mother stop looking for them before the search had barely begun? The behavioral evidence suggests answers that are difficult to accept but impossible to ignore. Sometimes the person who should be screaming loudest for justice is the one who already knows it will never come. Sometimes the parent who walks away from the search does so because they know exactly where the search should end. Lilly and Jack Sullivan were just 6 and 4 years old. They loved bugs and dinosaurs, gully things, and adventure. They were best friends who did everything together. They deserved a mother who would fight for them until her last breath. Instead, they got silence. Thank you for following Lilly and Jack's story to the end. If this case moved you, hit like and subscribe. We have more stories that deserve to be heard. These children deserve justice, and sometimes it takes all of us speaking up to ensure the truth comes to light. Share your thoughts, your feelings, and your final theory in the comments below.